Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our next episode of Insight CDT's presentation of storage. With me this morning is our Tim Cook and Jeff Bozic. They're both principal architects here with us at the Insight's Cloud and Data Center Transformation Division. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
We're excited to be here today. We've had a lot of fun prepping for this, and I think this is going to be a lively presentation. We've had a lot of conversations related to this. And I think the way we kind of like this, for the folks who are non-storage folks that are going to be watching this, let's kind of kick it off with a state of the industry with storage. Jeff, why don't you kick it off? Okay, go ahead, Tim.
So, I think we find ourselves in interesting times right now in the storage industry, with cloud obviously being rapidly adopted by, companies across the world. They're faced with challenges around what to do with the storage layer, right? Because our compute is pretty easy to move around from a storage perspective, whether it's moving all in on the cloud or even a hybrid cloud type environment. That tends to be the heavy lift. It's tough to move around. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of consideration. So really seen between companies out in the world, whether it's somebody utilizing storage or somebody creating new storage devices, they have to take that into consideration. And watching those plans kind of unfold on how to help customers get into that kind of a hybrid cloud environment has been interesting. And obviously, depending on who you choose, they've got very different strategies. So I think that's been one of the major talking points that we've had with companies throughout the world throughout 2020, 2019. That's been the big topic in my field. I don't know about you, Jeff.
I think it's similar. I think a lot of it comes down to, what is the best platform and how do I plan that out for the next few years when there's so much unknown? And that comes to everything from performance to price to where. I think performance is an interesting aspect where, we had the revolution of flash 5 years ago, and it really changed the game from a performance perspective. And now we're starting to see that consideration in two ways. One is there's even faster media that's coming out now, faster fabrics. So being able to get, lower latencies end to end, where that storage lives, to your point, introduces interesting kind of performance characteristics. And ultimately, where is my application going, and how am I going to meet the needs for my app in a few years, and how do I start to plan for that? So I think there's and then the dawn of scale out as well. I think that's another interesting decision point right now as people are trying to figure out what that new platform is. You talked about the new tech. So you have this concept of software defined and scale out storage. You still have traditional centralized storage. What's right? So lots of decisions.
Wow, that's a lot of stuff. So I think, from the perspective of storage, it used to be just kind of how fast or, spinning, how fast we went to flash. I think you guys kind of broached a lot of interesting topics right there. Excuse me. And I think, a lot of folks, business leaders, maybe who kind of had that snapshot of what they thought storage was back in the day, kind of relegate storage to a certain portion, position within the organization. And when they're thinking about things like, maybe public cloud or just cloud in general, they're thinking, oh, that storage decision's maybe already been made, by the infrastructure guys. What do you think of that?
I think that's a very interesting point. As Jeff alluded to, when it comes to flash, obviously that's driven down latencies tremendously, and it's set a different expectation among the application groups and the business owners for what they expect out of that storage platform. And one of the things that people, I think, don't take into consideration is they, move into that hybrid cloud scenarios. If you set an expectation of an SLA of, when we're talking sub 5 millisecond latency, the link from your end user to where the application lives can be extremely important. So if you've got people on a campus that are accessing something locally on the campus, and then you move it halfway across the United States or halfway across insert your country of choice, that latency all of a sudden becomes a very important play, just because the round trip out to something that's outside of your campus obviously has a significant influence when we've gotten to that sub 1 millisecond latency on campus. I think the other major point, especially for business decision owners or decision makers, business owners, is we've seen storage efficiencies really come on strong in that flash world. That's one of the driving factors is, hey, I can take, if I've got 8 copies of data, all of a sudden I'm only storing a single copy on my on-prem infrastructure. when we start looking at the cloud, you definitely have to take a look at that, because a lot of them don't give you back those savings, right? If you keep 8 copies, even if on the back end they're able to keep 1 copy, you still pay for your 8. So things like that often get overlooked. It's something that the infrastructure guys tend to be intimately aware of, but it doesn't always translate, right? When you get up to the higher levels where they shouldn't and don't want to know what's happening under the covers, but when they see their budget explode, obviously, then they start asking questions. So that's definitely something I've seen come up with companies in my local region for sure.
Yeah, Tim, it's funny. The cost aspect was one of the first places my head went to, especially as you relate it to public cloud, because that role of the storage admin, Jason, to your point, and your original question, is it all just handled by a team of people that specialize in that, focus on it? And the answer is yes, for the most part. But 2 things have really changed. One is the requirements for storage. As Tim and I are alluding to, it's really being driven by a complete transformation of how applications are written, what types of backend data stores they're using, where those applications are being written to, how they're using that data, what types of data it's even generating. So all of that is really changing the requirements that aren't necessarily flowing down to the team that has to manage storage. So that's one area where we see a lot of challenge. So the storage team might think that they're doing the right things, but ultimately what they're providing isn't meeting the needs. And then the other concept is, for the most part, I can achieve almost any performance and scale level in public cloud. Maybe not the super like microsecond latencies, but in terms of your standard millisecond latencies, standard flash level performance, I can absolutely achieve that in cloud. I can achieve that at a scale. I can replicate it. I can do all kinds of fun things that I traditionally expect to have on premises. But to Tim's point, that is insanely expensive. And then you start, some of the other points that Tim brought up that you just take for granted, things like data protection. So it's not just about price and performance, things like availability. Is the storage have to be available? What is my availability protecting from? Is the application handling now, data replication or data availability? So there's a lot of concepts that storage team is taking into consideration, that if you take them for granted and then remove that out of the stream, more than likely you're going to be inefficient. You're not going to get the performance you need. It's not going to be secure. Even just things like identity access, who has access to that storage and create it and delete it and all those kinds of fun things. All of those start to come into play. And if you don't take those into consideration up front, that's when we see people with these massive bills and, applications that aren't performing well and potentially unsatisfied customers.
For sure. And I would, in that vein, I think, especially when you're talking about forklift, like I want to be out of the data center. I want to move everything out to the public cloud, which is, it's doable. You need to understand that it's kind of takes 2 to tango, and they're both kind of maturing in that area. So there's a ton of APIs that have been available on-prem for on-premises for enterprise like backup applications that Jeff was alluding to earlier that are maturing. Initially, they weren't there at all in the public cloud. And so then you start looking at, hey, am I going to run an agent in every single system that I'm running out in the cloud? And that's kind of ugly. You can do it. It's not necessarily what I would recommend, but if you don't have any other options, that's kind of where you have to go. So you have to really dig in. I mean, those are the kind of details that at a high level, you can just kind of wave away and assume that, hey, it's just going to be there because all these people are in the cloud and everything's got to be there. All these people wouldn't be there, right? You just make assumptions based on what you're seeing in press releases and maybe some other companies. If you're building stuff from the ground up in the cloud, heck, most of that stuff you don't have to worry about. Now, if you're building a next gen app, a lot of times you're gonna build context into the application to take care of it itself. But if you're forklifting older stuff, especially if you've got commercial off-the-shelf software, they didn't necessarily build it with the cloud in mind. They didn't necessarily build it with the assumption that they had to take care of all that stuff, and they expect that you're bringing something else to the table to protect it. So really understanding what you have today and how you're going to take care of that as you move that towards the cloud is extremely important, because those details will absolutely bite you. You definitely don't want to make assumptions that, hey, if everybody else is there, then all this stuff has already been figured out. A lot of times it hasn't.
Tim, I'm sorry, Jason, I can't stress that enough, because that's the conversation of my clients that I'm really trying to get the point across. Why public cloud existed in the first place, and it was ultimately to serve those microservice-based apps, a newly written app. So as I start to move things into public cloud, if they weren't designed for that, more than likely it's going to be very expensive to support that. So understanding, why would I sit there and move something to a public cloud? Again, understanding what those requirements are and how much they're changing, and the storage teams typically don't understand what those needs are. One of the fundamental things that's happening in these new application patterns of development is disaggregating compute and storage, completely decoupling those. In your traditional monolithic app, they are very much tied together. Your web tier and your database tier are just kind of part of that monolithic app. And so in today's world, that is completely being decoupled. And so how's the application actually handling data? Where is it being run? Which service is talking to it? Which other services might need to talk to it? And I don't know if the storage teams or infrastructure teams are really grasping what that means to them. And especially as you move something out to public cloud, because again, if you're not doing it in the way that it was designed to be written for, with disaggregated storage that might be in smaller pieces, you mentioned some newer backend data stores and things of that nature. So if you're not really understanding that, then how are you going to be able to build an efficient and cost-effective and performant storage ecosystem? And then the other big, consideration there is, how am I going to protect that? It fundamentally changes data protection now. I can't just back up some storage volume, especially as an after the fact requirement, which it typically is. We all know this, application gets provisioned, and there's generally a data store already in VMware, but maybe they have to provision a data store, which is general purpose. And then I just sit there and someone says to the backup team, hey, there's this new app and we need to back it up. And storage volume's already protected. We're good, or something like that.
That's if you're lucky. Normally they come back and say, hey, I lost something. You were backing that up, right?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, no, I guess there's a requirement too.
You guys bring up some really interesting points. So, we deal a lot with leadership when we're talking about transformation and those kinds of things. And I think, one of those things that, and you, Jeff, I think you mentioned it earlier, which was, can we do these things in the cloud? Yes. And sometimes that's the only answer that some people are listening for. Oh, we can do it in the cloud. We can get those same levels done, and we'll work it out with efficiencies on the back end. And then there's this astronomical price. And then they're looking at the storage guys like it was their fault that all of this happened in the beginning, right? And I think, you also mentioned the concept of data gravity. I think maybe that was you, Tim, that said that earlier. Yeah. Is this what you're talking about with those kinds of things?
For sure. I mean, we spend a lot of time, hopefully on the front end, with companies kind of figuring out what their data gravity looks like, right? So that, we have a whole service where we go out there.
Explain that concept of data gravity just for the folks.
Yeah. So data gravity is really the idea that, especially in reference to the public cloud, the hardest thing to move around is your data itself, right? Compute is pretty easy to spin up, spin down. That's something the cloud is great at, right? We've got a workload that we need to process, and it needs 1 billion CPUs for half an hour. Cloud is amazing for that. You don't want to make that investment on premises to buy thousands and thousands of servers for something that you run for 10 minutes or even a couple hours once a month. But the problem with that is getting access back to that data, making sure that it's fast and consistent, is really what's driving those decisions, right? So if I spin up 1,000 CPUs in the cloud, but it's got to access data that's sitting in a data center in South America on a 56K modem, right? It's going to take you years to actually pull it all in, process it, and push it all back. So where that data is placed is extremely important. And then when we look at, hey, as I mentioned before, maybe I've got people that are in my campus, and that's the primary use case, that those are the users that are accessing it. Well, if I stick it halfway across the world, their experience is probably going to be horrible. On the flip side, if my end user, you look at somebody like a Netflix is spread out across the entire globe, well, it may matter less where the primary source of data is, but that's when you start looking at things like, hey, how do we caching devices closer to the end user? So, and I guess the final thing is, if you really look at all of the major cloud providers, understandably so, pulling data out tends to be really, really expensive. Getting it in is pretty cheap. And part of that is that data gravity, right? They know that if your data is close to them, then you're probably going to spin up your compute close to them. It's a way to entice you to stay there. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of workloads that work really, really well in the public cloud, but it's something that you always have to consider when you're talking about moving the data, because, you look at, hey, I can just get a snowball, or I know Azure's got an option as well to push everything out there. Well, if you decide that you don't want to stay, getting it back again can be extremely expensive. So you just really have to consider that when you're looking at how you're moving things around, whether it's on premises or even in the public cloud. Because quite frankly, even if you're moving it within your own data centers halfway across the world, it can take days, weeks, months, and it's something that you really have to consider, for sure.
And when I'm talking to clients these days, it's not like they're trying to have less data. They want to save every single thing everywhere. And then the metadata, let's save that too. And it becomes actually, that's the thing that they're looking for. So, I mean, this is not going away anytime soon.
Well, no, I think everybody's seen the Times cover where, you know, data is the new oil, and it's absolutely true.
Yeah, and the funny part is they don't, to Tim's point, and the whole concept of data gravity is they have no idea how to actually extract value out of that data.
For sure.
But they just know they will one day.
Or that they think they will.
Totally.
And so they do. And then, you know, not only do they want to keep more data, we're generating more data. And then on top of that, not only generating more data, but then, you know, people are, it's not just they're keeping more data, they're keeping data that typically has no use. Just again, on that, maybe one day this will do something for me. Even just the concept of a data lake, I think is comical because, you know, when it really came around, I think a lot of people misunderstood what it meant, and they thought it was just this dumping ground. Let me just create this big pool where I can dump all my data, and at some point, some magical system is going to come in and extract a whole bunch of value out of that.
That's AI.
Somehow, I guess, maybe discard the other data. I don't know what it is yet, but it's going to happen. That's what this data warehouse is. So it just became a huge dumping ground. Data lake. Just became this huge dumping ground, and is more just a bigger data warehouse than an actual data lake.
Well, and we have entire careers that are built around companies that dumped everything into one giant dumping ground and one giant lake, and have to figure out how to actually get the useful information out of that. And to Jeff's point, I mean, if you can be thoughtful on the front end, I mean, sometimes it's not always an option, but if you can be thoughtful on the front end on how you're organizing that to have some sort of sanity and structure to it, if you do eventually get to a point where you understand what kind of value you're trying to extract from it, your life will be so much better. Because your AI guys, machine learning guys, they need the data, and they still need the data in the same format to actually make use of it. So the idea of to Jeff's point, the data lake, where I just throw everything in and the computers will magically extract it and get it into a same format, isn't as easy as it might sound on paper.
You know, actually, real quick anecdote on that. I don't want to go too far off topic, but I actually had this premise at one point that because we help so many clients with storage and data protection, that we know the storage footprint of a lot of our clients. We know for the most part what kind of applications, what kind of data they're generating. And, 4 or 5 years ago when this was a really hot topic, we were hiring some data scientists, and I went and talked to this one guy who's going through his master's program. And I had this idea that maybe we could go to a client with this guy, go to, an executive and say, hey, based on what we know about your data, here's some cool value you might be able to extract from that, and kind of reverse engineer, getting our data scientists in there to see if there's some cool AI that we can maybe start helping them with. And I remember he said to me, that's not the way that it works. You have to start with he goes, a data scientist isn't sitting there saying, just abstractly thinking about what value you could extract from just a glob of data. It's more of, hey, give me a question you want answered, and then based on the data you have, I'll be able to tell you how to extract value out of that. And so that was mind-opening to me. And I'm sitting there thinking, how many IT leaders don't understand this concept and might be thinking the way that I am, that, man, if I just start storing everything, at some point, someone's going to come into our organization and be like, haha, here's what we can get from all this data.
I have the same story. It's hilarious because I think, guys like us think that way, and it was kind of sold to, the community at large that way, but that's just not how it works.
Well, in your world, Jason, it's asking the guy that's writing the new AES encryption algorithm, okay, now what should I encrypt in my data center? Like, I have no idea, dude. I'm just writing the program to do it for you.
And same, I had 14 PhD data scientists working for me at a certain point, and I was expecting them to tell me what to do. And they were like, no, ask us a cool question and we will answer it with this data. I mean, they found great ways to pare the data down and to deal with the duplications and the metadata creation and that type of stuff to make it faster. They were not good at understanding what the questions. And I guess that's kind of what where you get to that PhD level, that's kind of where they have to get to what questions can I answer? It's an interesting scenario.
Real quick, actually, something Tim just touched upon there that directly relates to storage here about how, people aren't really asking the right questions. A lot of the things that we've heard over the last couple of years, and I know Tim's heard this question from clients, is around like encryption at rest versus encryption in flight, and those types of, and everyone wants encryption in flight. You ask them why, they have no idea. the impact that has on your backend storage can be astronomical.
Sure.
That completely eliminates all of your space efficiencies on your storage arrays in the back end. So especially on premises, where you're realizing deduplication and compression, all of a sudden you start encrypting all your data in flight, or encrypting at the app level. You just destroyed your space efficiencies. So it's not to say that that requirement's not there, but you better make sure that that requirement is actually there, because it's going to cost you on the storage side, hands down. It could be a pretty expensive uplift there.
Well, the one thing I would say on that front too, sorry to cut in, Jason, is we have seen vendors that we work with start to build in functionality to work with the end applications that might be doing encryption to, I guess, be able to encrypt it on the client, send the package over, and then decrypt it on your end storage device before committing it to disk to kind of work around that. But that's another one of those things like the cloud discussion before. It's still pretty new, and it's definitely not everybody, and it's definitely something that the details matter a ton. So if you end up in that scenario, it's another area where you definitely want to spend some time looking into your options and making sure not to make assumptions around all. Some people do it, so I'm sure everybody does it, because everybody definitely does not do that today.
That is a great point. And it comes right back to storage, which I'll kind of wedge this right back in. So when I'm talking to folks about encryption and their knee-jerk reaction is to encrypt everything, I know that they don't really have a plan. It's like, hey, if I check this box and everything's encrypted, well, then encryption's not going to be a problem. Nobody's going to say my stuff's not encrypted. And I think we talked a little bit about folks not understanding their storage requirements, and it gets them into a lot of trouble in the exact same fashion. Do you guys want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think, and I think this is more true it's always kind of been true that for the most part, storage teams didn't necessarily fully understand the application requirements, but for the most part, those requirements were flowing down from an app team, especially if it's a custom-written app, to some sort of a data team that was creating a database. They were requesting compute resources, and it was pretty minimal, right? As again, maybe a traditional 3-tier app. So it wasn't too hard to extrapolate what their storage requirements were. As you start to get into this, more cloud native DevOpsy world that most people are trying to get into somehow, the application is really driving what those requirements are. No longer can IT be the one saying, hey, this is what I'm providing, these are the capabilities, and this is what you get. Kind of born with shadow IT, ultimately, because that wasn't serving the needs of application developers. And you ask, okay, well, then why are applications really transforming? And I think you have to start with that question. And it's because ultimately the business is trying to transform how they're interacting with their clients, the speed and agility with which they can understand and reach and react to their clients. That's driving that. It's not some developer that's just like, oh, this is a neat new way to develop something, and so I'm going to do that. It's going to change your world from the infrastructure team, and just do it because I think it's fun. This is truly serving a company need. It's a company directive that's being pushed down. So as that's changing, you really have to understand what those needs of the app are, what is really changing there, and bridging that gap so that you can better understand what the requirements are, not only of storage, but again, I think that data protection conversation has to very tightly couple more than ever with that data conversation. So I think, creating a bridge between infrastructure and app dev, whatever that bridge might be, maybe it is, in fact, one of my clients has had actually a client-facing outage because caused by a storage issue that, it's hard to pinpoint whose actually fault it was, but it was ultimately due to just complete communication breakdowns of an application team that's developing things in certain ways, a storage team that's trying to support that. There's a very big breakdown, and ultimately you had a storage volume that got overconsumed, latency spiked into 2 seconds, and brought things down for almost 2 days. So, I think whether you call it becoming agile, cross-functional teams, DevOps across all of IT, including infrastructure, whatever you want to call it, at some point, storage teams, infrastructure teams, if you just ask that application developer, hey, what is changing? What is really changing here? What are the needs for storage and data protection? You now have a bigger role of something like a data architect, because no longer is it just SQL and Oracle. And you want to become more efficient. You have way more new types of databases for specific things, whether it's for networking people together versus just your traditional kind of like order database or something like that. So building those bridges, infrastructure teams realizing their world is changing, realizing that the app dev people aren't the bad ones and they're not the ones that are making these changes just because they want to, and actually understanding what the needs of the business are, meaning what are the needs of the app team driving down. That's a start to kind of help making people's worlds a little bit more sane, starting to really wrangle in some of that shadow IT and IT actually enabling the business and providing what app dev teams really need.
And to tag on that, I mean, the two messages that I would absolutely throw out there for the app guys, understand that, public cloud doesn't magically mean that you don't have to know what's going on, down in the gory details. You can operate that way, but I've seen time and time again, even on some very public facing large companies where they assume that they didn't need to know any of that. And then when, they scale from 50 users to 5,000 users, all of a sudden those decisions they made early on are pretty ugly. So, I would encourage them to embrace the years of tribal knowledge with their infrastructure group to help them understand some of those decisions. And for the infrastructure guys, cloud new and scary, and it's so different. And what we found is that when you really boil it down, I spend a ton of my time being the human decoder ring of all these things that you've done for decades on premises, you're doing in the cloud. They've just changed the names for a lot of it. Maybe some of how you access it has changed a little bit, but the basic concepts haven't changed at all. So it's really just understanding like, oh, when I was doing it on campus, this is what it looked like. In the cloud, this is what it looks like. It's still the same stuff. It just might have different names. And hey, you might, from a data protection perspective, you might have to do things slightly differently, but the concepts haven't changed. So, it looks scary because it's so vast and all the names have changed, but in reality, it's still right in your wheelhouse. So working with those application guys, to Jeff's point, and helping them understand what and helping guide them, I think, as long as you're aligning yourself closer to the business, can be a very successful partnership.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Tim, as you're mentioning that, another thought that kind of popped in my head is, especially for infrastructure teams, and especially around storage, because of it does generally cost the most to move. It generally is what is most costly when it's moved, in terms of generating more cost and spend than expected.
And even the move itself, to your point, to cut in real quick, Jeff, is I'm
kidding.
generating data constantly where it lives today, and I'm trying to move it at the same time. Like, you still have to figure out how do I actually cut over while not actually stopping operations. I mean, that in itself is, rocket surgery.
Exactly. But if apps are moving to public cloud, and you're an infrastructure team, and you're sitting there saying, "What? No one's consuming my storage anymore." Don't assume that don't just be super reactive in the sense of, oh, okay, now I need to figure out how I can support that public cloud, or maybe I need to go learn public cloud or figure out how to architect. Realize that the reason, for the most part, they went there is because you weren't able to provide the capabilities they were looking for. But don't take that as a knock. It's not your fault. The industry has moved really fast. And ultimately, to me, Tim's heard me harp on this many times. I kind of hate the term DevOps. And to me, this is almost a result of that. DevOps was almost indicating that it was just around developers and operations. And that's really all you needed. And so all of the innovation around, operations, even just the agile framework, I don't understand why that is only applied to app and dev and operations. Why is that not across all of IT, specifically, especially security? Jason, your point, why is DevSecOps a separate thing? That makes no sense to me. But the fact that storage teams, for the most part, didn't even really know this was happening in a lot of ways. They were still providing capabilities and services for the traditional infrastructure. So don't assume it was the right decision. Don't feel bad about the fact that you didn't have the skills or knowledge or tool set to, people, process, technology, the magical triad, to actually provide those capabilities. Your management and the directors might not have come down to your organization to have to provide those. So recognize that decision was probably made without the right criteria. Your value in the organization is not spinning up storage runs. Your value is not adding a client to a data protection policy. Your value is understanding where is the best place to put that. Is it providing the needs for the business, whether it's snapshots, replication, performance, availability, security, IAM, archive, how's it being life cycled? Are backups being replicated off site? Is it meeting compliance needs? for how long I need to store this data. Those capabilities and those attributes, that thinking is your value. And very much to Tim's point, that can translate really wherever the platform is. You might have to learn those tools. But again, if you go back to the business and ask, what do you need? And then understand those requirements, say, I can do that for you on-prem. That's where we can really start to get to these good synergies. And maybe you can't, or maybe it might take some time to get there, and operating public cloud is the right place for today. That's okay, but you can learn those skill sets. You can still up level your skills on-prem, start to figure out, I'd also encourage, before you try to figure out how to change your process for how you're going to gather those requirements and maybe build a cross-functional team, or how requirements are going to flow. Focus on that before you really focus on technology changes on the back end. I hear a lot of people saying, well, I need software-defined storage so that it can be all programmatically accessed and I can use infrastructure as code to deploy it all. And it's like, that's well and good, but that's where the mature organizations can take what they've already developed as a process, as a way the organization communication flows, people understand and are aligned to what we're trying to do, and then you build the skill sets, and now you can start to adopt that to a newer technology. So be proud of what value you add. Don't feel slighted of the fact that shadow IT happened. Just recognize that you absolutely add value, and just requirements were changing, and now we can kumbaya, for lack of a better word.
Meet back in the middle.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
You are the storage messiah.
He is indeed.
Nice. No, I think, dude, that was just so inspiring what you just said, and it's absolutely true. I mean, I think and it's not a technology problem. It's a people problem. We've got to change the way that we do things. We can't look at storage or any part of the business as it's just this, I fulfill orders to the rest of the business. I don't have any idea what they're doing. And so I would say, do you guys have anything? So there's certainly some business leaders that are listening to this. What would you tell them? What do they need to do?
Well, I think, the first, and I think it kind of tags along with what Jeff was just saying, is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
Your people have a lot of information and understanding of how you got to where you're at today. And it's well and good to build a whole new team. And a lot of times I've seen clients build a whole new team with outsiders to come in because they say, like, our guys are pushing back on cloud, and the only way forward is to bring in a whole new team. Well, those guys don't know how you got from A to B. And It's really easy to point and say, I can't believe, why would anybody ever do that? Well, generally speaking, I won't say that we make great decisions in our business or any other all the time, but generally speaking, there was a reason why you got to where you are. And when you just put those guys on the outside and just say, we've got these new people that are really smart and they're going to take care of this, you might make that same mistake 2 or 3 times when you decide to move it somewhere else because they don't understand how you got there in the first place. So just to kind of pile on to what Jeff was saying, even if you feel like you need to build a new team, make sure that you have at least some of your senior guys on that team so they can help, even if they're coming in and out, right? Because maybe they still have their day job. They have to keep the lights on with the infrastructure you've got today, but making sure that they're intimately involved so that you don't repeat past mistakes. I think the other thing too is, as you're moving to the public cloud, the holy grail is, hey, let's build things from scratch, built for the cloud. That's not always going to be possible. Sometimes you are going to have to lift and shift, but there's good and bad ways to do that. Make sure that you understand your data flows, again, data gravity, so that when you do pick up an app and move it, you don't go, oh yeah, we forgot this one specific database or this one specific piece of storage that needed to go with it. Because obviously that's going to get you into a lot of trouble. So concentrate on that. And to the point of, you can't necessarily overnight rip and replace. Heck, what was it last year? Amazon had their big announcement, and I don't blame them that they finally were getting everything off of Oracle. Talking about a company that basically built their entire business on the cloud, and even they took that long to get off of Oracle. Mm-hmm. And that was with, plenty of infighting. The two companies didn't love each other before that happened. So if you look at something like that, don't expect your guys to overnight say, all right, guys, we're just going to rebuild this app and replatform it, and it's going to be overnight. And if we can't do that, then it was a failure as a company. That stuff takes time. So definitely take baby steps, because you don't want to create more havoc than when you're in the middle of trying to move things too, right? You have to have a very thoughtful plan to doing those events.
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of the really good points there. It's interesting on lifting and shifting, or even just if it is a microservice-based app. One of the other interesting things that I hear a lot of people poo-poo is the cost of egress traffic out of a public cloud. And it is very, very minimal. But I've seen, and I've had clients that have had to pull back because they've moved an app, whether it was a microservice or a lift and shift, where that app was talking to some sort of SaaS-based service, or that microservice was, creating maybe sending logs to like Splunk Cloud or something like that. That is all egress charge. And over time, especially if you're talking, hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of log events, it becomes material. So to your point, understanding, what you're doing and how storage, that's the other thing is as you move data to a public cloud, how you pay for it changes drastically. I've always said public cloud is nothing more than a different consumption model, both from a technology perspective. I'm consuming my technology very differently, and I'm also consuming it financially very differently. So understanding all those different nuances of both of those, especially around storage, is going to help you, I think, maybe understand the storage costs a little bit better up front. But, Jason, it's interesting because Tim touched upon one of the two biggest things I hear about from executives and leaders when I talk to them about just what their strategies are and what digital transformation means to them and where they're at in that journey. And we come down to storage quite often. A lot of them, it is, how do I manage it? How do I manage my infrastructure? And how do I replace or augment the skill gap? And I've had the question asked directly, do I just fire my old team and hire new, to Tim's point? I think Tim touched upon all the really critical points as to why it's not necessarily a yes, it's not necessarily a no. But one of the other things about finding the internal people, other than the tribal knowledge, which is critical, internal people that are motivated to want to do good for your business is one of the most powerful forces you could have on your team.
Absolutely. Sure.
And a lot of people are there. They're going to be the ones that are going to want to train. They're going to want to not think about how cool this technology and what's fun and shiny, but what's actually adding value to the business. Is this doing the right thing? They're also the ones, as you start to think about those cross-functional teams, just as human beings, you're going to be more receptive to somebody that works for that organization,
yes,
rather than some new guy that comes in and thinks that he's hot stuff. So you very well likely have to augment skills, but if you can find the individuals in your organization that want to transform and keep them as part of that team, there's so much value there.
Just real quick, Jeff, they can be the translator between those two teams as well, right? Because to
Absolutely.
Jeff's point, when you're bringing in brand new guys, they may not even be speaking the same language. If you've got somebody that's really trying to advance your business, they're going to take the time to understand both worlds. But more importantly, they hopefully get away from the mind fighting and really focus on, this is the better approach, or this is the better approach based on what's best for the business versus, I want it all to be in the cloud. I want it to be all on premises or anything even in between.
Well, and it's interesting you say that because, we've kind of danced around it. And I even dance around it around customers because not all of them like to hear how much culture drives innovation and change, and especially transformation. And when you're talking about culture, the fascinating part about it is you definitely need the guy that understands the stresses in the organization, where the culture conflicts are, where the communication paths break down, personality conflicts.
Yep.
To your point, Tim, what has been tried in the past? Why did it fail? That is critical to building that bridge. But at the same point, that same guy might also be poisoned by some of that bad culture that needs to change.
Yep.
So I don't think it can just be the fresh face, because he doesn't know any of these things and is likely going to walk into landmines or not know what landmines he's leading an organization into. But at the same time, that fresh perspective can sometimes be needed. So, I really do think there's kind of a two-pronged approach or a unified approach there maybe. But the other one topic, Jason, that I hear quite a bit from leaders, executive leaders, is around, and especially around storage, actually storage more than anything, is I have my infrastructure is aging today, so I need to refresh it. I have no idea how to plan, whether it's capacity planning or the technology that I need for what's on premises, because I know I have some sort of cloud strategy or transformation strategy. I know there's shadow IT happening. I know there's directives to move more things to public cloud or SaaS or whatever the case may be. So I have no idea what my storage needs are going to be in 3 years. I have no idea where my applications are going to live. I have no idea what capabilities my storage is going to need in 3 years. So how do I plan for that purchase today? I'm out of capacity, man. I need to do something now, or I'm out of support. Support's a worse one because things are still working. You know, so now you're just introducing risk while the lights are actually staying on. But you know, that's a big question I get. And so, and a lot of people want to just move things to public cloud because they get this scale and agility, and they think, well, you know, to Tim's point earlier, and actually Jason, your point, well, someone else is taking care of it. It's easy. It's there. I don't have to worry about it. I just dump it up there. And, you know, I'd say to those leaders, and I think Tim made this point really, really well. I love the example about how long it took Netflix to get off of, or I'm sorry, Amazon off of Oracle. Yep. People also don't realize, so Netflix, you know, people don't realize how long it took them to get from when they realized they had to break down their monolithic app because it wasn't going to serve their needs, which was really just around the mailing DVD service. It took them about from ideation to actually delivering fully new Netflix. It was microservice-based and public cloud and all that fun stuff was about 7 years from what I understand. And from the time they actually started writing, and a lot of it was culture change. Yeah. And then by the time they actually started implementing technology, it was about 3 years before they finally had it all buttoned up. It was not this, to your point, you know, in a week or in a month or 6 months. It took a while. And for your organization, to whomever is watching this, especially as executives, it's going to take time. And no tool. The biggest mistake we see is them thinking a tool is going to solve this problem. Some new storage platform is going to have all the APIs and the magic and the data management and the data protection all integrated in, and Kubernetes integration and AWS integration. And I don't
bingo.
Yeah, exactly. I don't need, you know, anyone to manage it. And you're waiting for that, or you're waiting to say, okay, all this is going to go to public cloud and I need to store it. It's going to take time. Storage, we already touched upon it, is going to grow. So I think we have to remove a little bit of that analysis paralysis and make your investment. Technical debt, minimizing technical debt is one of the measures of digital transformation. And what that precludes is there will be technical debt. You cannot avoid it. And so minimizing it, you know, considering it, taking into consideration, it's awesome. I mean, that's what your role is. But ultimately, at some point, you're going to have to assume technical debt. Storage is a really, really hard one because it's a very expensive purchase, but it's going to be more expensive up in the public cloud. You'll probably actually consume more technical debt by making the wrong decision rather than just, you know, again, a point I was making earlier, you can't change all three, people, processes, technology at the same time. The human cognitive load just isn't there. So, you know, we know the people and process has to change. Tools will help enable that. So in my opinion, you know, keep your tools and technology as unchanged as you can, so that you can focus on what you can change without having to have all kinds of new stuff. And then once you get that down pat, that being said, I mean, we can modernize infrastructure, and that's where companies like Insight really come and help. I mean, Tim's amazing at this. We have a whole team. I mean, half of our team is our storage experts that go in and say, okay, you want to modernize your infrastructure to today. Let me at least help you make decisions of infrastructure that can start to play into cloud native development. That one that's not going to hamper you, one that might even have flexibility of moving capacity to public clouds and things of that nature. So we can help you make the most intelligent decision today, but ultimately you just need to make a choice. You probably need to make a purchase to keep your lights on. Because if you're not keeping your lights on, then what you're planning for 3 years is might be irrelevant.
And I was going to say, I think that's key. You know, again, back to the data gravity thing. When you're budgeting for this, you just have to expect that there's probably going to be a 1 to 2 year overlap there where your costs are going to skyrocket as you're moving from on-premises to in the cloud. Don't expect your team to be able to magically snap their fingers and have you out there, you know, hey, our support ends in 6 months. You guys just need to get this done. That's folly. And obviously, you know, for the executives, you're selling that up to the board that, hey, we're going to eliminate all of our on-premises support costs in 6 months. It's probably not going to end well for anyone. And that's, again, going back to the culture, there has to be buy-in from everybody to see what the end vision is, and understanding that, you know, short-term pain for the long-term gain is absolutely something that can potentially happen if you're trying to do a wholesale move. So just please don't forget that you've got to continue keeping the lights on premises and keeping budget for that support cost. Don't just assume that, hey, we're going to get off of it eventually anyway, so we're going to let support lapse, and we'll figure it out when we get there. I've seen that happen before, so try to avoid that.
No, I love that, and I love I love to do something now, but
yeah,
and don't just wait until you have it, because I'm pretty sure that Netflix didn't have it all figured out, every nut and bolt for all 10 years, and we're just marching to that. It's an iterative process. Somebody can help you make smarter decisions to deal with that iterative process. And it's more than just the technology. I love that aspect. I mean, I love the inspiration from the storage perspective and the infrastructure, folks that own infrastructure within an organization, that partnership is extremely important with the rest of the organization. You're an enabler and can be a very serious enabler to the way that apps are developed and that the way the strategy of that transformation happens. And then from a business leader perspective, their influence is important as well, not to compartmentalize everything, not to think that fire this team and bring in consultants to build it for us. Because like you said, on a 10-year journey, you might not even have the consultants with you that long. And you need a team that's going to help you and understand where the bodies are buried, why we, because I loved your point about we got here because these guys put it together based on what the need was at the time, and we're running. The fact that we can even hire an external entity is we're running, and we have capital to hire an external entity. So the fact is that's important, because that capability has grown with the organization, and you want these guys to help you grow into the next facet.
And it might not be, I guess just to tie on that real quick as well, especially for executives that might be listening to this, it doesn't have to be hire. In fact, a lot of more what we're doing to help our clients through this is residents. Like a 6-month resident that is that expert, that kind of is that parachutist. Because the great thing about that, especially if it's a resident being provided by someone like Insight, is now we also have oversight into what you're doing as an organization and how that person can plug in. But then they become a part of your team for those 6 months to introduce some of that change, those new ideas, understand where people's biases are and predispositions based on the culture that they've operated in for so long, and say, hey, these are some change areas that we can focus on. So it might not just be hiring or replacing the team, but augmenting in the short term can be hugely valuable through this.
And we've had a lot of success there too, because it tends honestly to get more buy-in from your team, because they don't feel like they're being replaced; they feel like they're being helped on the journey. And from again, back to culture, it's a very different experience when you see upper management bring in a whole new team versus we brought in these residents to help you guys on this journey, because we're going here and we want you all on board, but we're not looking to replace you, we're looking to help you transform. And the ones that want to, I think, embrace that, and the ones that don't, they might just say, this isn't for me, I'm going to do something else. But try and help them come along on the journey with you for sure.
I love it.
So just, I guess there's kind of parting words ultimately would be, in this digital transformation age, everything's changing, the people, process, technology, the triad we talked about. As it relates to storage, this concept of storage gravity and it being very heavy and very expensive to move and to actually store and consume, really, I think needs to filter into the decision process of executives. The wholesale move really can't be the play here. Really coupling data protection into the storage decisions more than ever, especially when you're talking about more cloud native type of applications. And then I guess the third is, again, in this transformation world, as you're moving more towards a DevOps model and the app dev teams are developing things in a new way, is really starting to build that bridge from your storage and data protection teams to the data architects that are generally further left. I mean, they're generally kind of right after the app architecture. But even if you can move further left to the app team, just ask them, hey, what are your needs? We'd love to be able to enable you. And don't feel threatened by AWS. Don't feel threatened by the app dev team. Feel that it is absolutely your value to help enable them. I guess that'd be my parting sentiment.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add on to that, and it kind of goes what Jeff was saying, from a data gravity perspective, please don't take your 2020 budget, right-click, copy-paste into 2021. It almost assuredly is going to be more expensive. So you really want to do a detailed analysis. I mean, when I look at the entire stack, that is probably going to be your primary cost for most businesses. So you just definitely want to do a detailed analysis. You understand your costs when you get there. That's not to say don't do it. There's absolutely value that can be derived moving your stuff into the public cloud, but just make sure that you're doing the analysis required ahead of time so that you don't get that sticker shock that we see a lot of customers end up with.
Awesome. Jeff, Tim, you guys are awesome. It was really cool to have a conversation with some storage rock stars. Thanks for the insight. Thanks for the motivation. For those of you out there who want more information about what we offer and some additional collateral, please visit us at insightcdct.com. And thanks for joining us. Have a good day.
Thanks a lot, Jason.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.